Hey YouTube, welcome back to the RPG Daily. I'm your host Richard Quiner, and I'm back today with another Game Master's Craft. This episode has been a long time coming. The guest today, I've played a lot of different games with him over the last year or so, a little more than a year now thanks to COVID. But he is a creative mind that's made multiple RPG systems, not just stories, systems. He's done Larp game mastering, which is a whole other ball game, and he's also an avid board gamer, so there's that as well. Anyway, so we're going to get into this with Bruce Monach. Bruce, welcome to the show. I'm glad we finally made this work. Last time, I had brought this up a while back, pre-COVID, and then COVID happened, and I brought it up, and timelines never worked out, but we made it. You're here.
Yeah.
How are you?
Yeah, doing pretty well. Hanging out, working on my current game.
Yes, which we're going to get into, but first I want to know, how did you get into the tabletop gaming lifestyle, I guess we could call it? Yeah, where did that all begin for you?
Well, it began before I could read, because my dad was actually an OG Dungeons & Dragons player. Played with Gary Gygax. I have one of the original D&D in a box sets. And nice. When I was a little kid, my dad ran me through dungeons. I played a paladin with the original Dungeons & Dragons. And it was a lot of fun. So he introduced me and also my brother who played with us to the game. And we started running it with a lot of our friends. We started bringing our friends from school into it, running our games. It even got to the point where in 8th grade, we had to do our big project. And what we ended up doing was actually doing a paper and presentation on Dungeons & Dragons that involved getting like 10 of our fellow students who had never played before to play a game. And it was pretty crazy. So then fast forward to now. Oh, and I guess it's relevant to say that in college, my sophomore year is when I got into LARPing.
Okay. So and what was your first LARPing, like what got you into that?
I think like many people, it was Vampire the Masquerade.
I think that's been a very recurring answer in a lot of questions. I still have not experienced that game myself, but I know you've run quite a few Vampire LARPs, and then you created your own LARP system for Akile Island, which we'll get to that a little bit later. But all this has led you now to your current project, your Anesidora. Tell me a little bit about Anesidora, as if I were someone who didn't know anything about it.
So Anesidora is a mythic sci-fi role-playing game where you play characters who are destined to be heroes in a world ruled by magic that is actually ancient technology. So what people think of as gods are actually giant crashed spaceships, and the artificial intelligences that were designed to give the illusion of these ancient godlike figures are now seen as truly those gods. So people actually believe that Zeus is that giant ship that is crashed over in the mountainside. I mean, you can go have a conversation with him. He can fire giant energy bolts that can destroy his enemies. I mean, it's Zeus. And so you adventure in this world, and we have this mythology. It's mostly inspired by Greek, Egyptian, Norse, and Celtic mythology. But we also have a few influences from other mythos, as well as lots of original sci-fi and alien elements, because Anesidora is an alien and strange world where you have genetic engineering and super science that has created all sorts of strange items and creatures and stuff, and you get to go on adventures. And yeah, that's the basic pitch for the setting.
That's a pretty good pitch. I mean, it sounds like so no one here on the channel really knows, but I've played in Anesidora's world quite a bit. Still pretty low level, I think, because we intend to end up goofing off and getting into baking competitions more than actually solving problems and saving the world, or, you know, figuring out the political sabotages that are happening. But this system that you created, you've also developed, you made your own dice for it with the symbols. You came up with a way to make that work mechanically speaking, so the dice matter, and the more dice you have this whole system built out. What was the biggest struggle you had in making these systems for the game?
I would definitely say the biggest struggle with the system itself is that in order to play the game, you use 12-sided dice that have 6 different symbols on them, and there aren't all the same number of each type of symbol. Mm-hmm. So when you roll, you have to read the signs, and the symbols are worth different amounts. You kind of add them together by making pairs. And in addition, if you get large sets of certain symbols, you get what we call fate. Yeah. And that fate system is what creates strange things to happen to your character. But the most basic thing is success and failure. And what we ended up finding was we actually ran a lot of the math. And since it's a dice pool system, the math can sometimes be really hard to follow. Not intuitive. So when you roll a 20-sided die, it's pretty easy to understand that each step is 5%. Mm-hmm. So you can adjust difficulties based on those percentage numbers. But when you're running a dice pool system, and each die you add changes the amount of success that is actually possible, you actually end up in this weird scaling system where the difference between what you could pass with 4 dice and what you can pass with 8 dice is absolutely bonkers. Mm-hmm. Things that people with 4 dice would be passing 25% of the time in a rough, hard test. People with 8 dice are just knocking out the gate.
Right.
So we actually ended up putting together a spreadsheet that calculates all the various math and percentages, and we plan on putting it in the book when we release it. On the basis that I feel like people play dice pool systems and you don't always know what the math actually is. You have a general idea, more dice equals better. Yeah. But what percentages you're actually adjusting, we thought it would be useful if a game master goes, I want to throw a challenge at a guy who's got a rating of 7, so he's throwing 7 dice, but I want him to pass about half the time. How difficult should the test be? And we have a chart for that. That was definitely the hardest part of the system.
Yeah, that sounds like a real challenge, and I know you guys have been working on it and revising it and making changes and tweaks for a very long time. I did link your YouTube channel. I should also link is Anesidora stream on your YouTube channel, or is that on Arcana's?
I don't know if it's online. Mostly because I have all the episodes, but it is the rules are so dated.
Right, that makes sense.
I didn't want people to go to my YouTube channel and watch the stream and be like, oh, this is how you play Anesidora, because I'd have to be like, whoa, we shot this stream 3 years ago before we were even going to make a game, and it was just for fun.
Right, okay. So forget that. Don't look it up.
Yeah, I will say my YouTube channel does have a introduction to the world of Anesidora video that I made. And that is the setting is still true to what we did that far ago.
Okay.
And in addition, there's AnesidoraTheGame.com, which is a website that has a lot of information about the setting and what we're doing with it, and some of the art, too.
Oh, nice. And the art, I know you put a lot of work in finding really great artists to come out and do things for Anesidora. So I'm going to have to remind myself to go add that link in the description of this video after the stream, because there's some great stuff there. What made you say, you know what, I want to make a system to play a game? What made you take that step when you have so many others out there?
So for me, I feel like many people say it, but I like when the system plays to what you want to get from the game. Mm-hmm. And what I wanted from the game was the sense of this overarching fate. And you can see it in D&D is very much a pass-fail system. Yeah. But then you have the Empire game from Star Wars. What is it called? Something Empire?
The D20 one or the D6 one?
The one with the fancy dice.
Oh, I don't know. Empire.
I think it might be Star Wars Edge of the Empire, if I remember correctly. But there is a Star Wars role-playing game, and it uses these special dice, and they have two different symbols. One is pass-fail, and the other is good-bad. So by rolling the dice, you can generate something that is a pass, but also something bad happens, or something is a failure, but also something good happens, or stack, because they're separate symbols that don't interact with each other. So we were kind of inspired by what they were doing with systems like that, and made a more complicated system where we have 4 different types of fate that you can actually generate, which are insight, which is basically like a critical success, like just super, super good check. Then we have a fumble, which is just a terrible check where you automatically fail and bad things happen.
Yeah.
And then in addition, we have good fate and bad fate, or like divine intervention and divine punishment is what we call them, where something outside of this test happens that either helps you or hurts you. And they're all based on which symbols you actually roll on the dice.
Yeah, which is kind of crazy sometimes. But I think that's an interesting idea, and that brings me to the thought in terms of storytelling, the idea of failing forward. Because the idea that you can fail something and also have it, or you can succeed at something and have it go really badly, or you can fail at something and have it be good, is a really interesting way to think. That's just what popped into my head about it, of like, this is how it can work.
It does remind me of another one of our design philosophies in it is, in a lot of games, if you fail, it's just like either it's really, really bad and awful and you don't want to fail, or failing is so bad that the system almost won't allow you to fail. And so what we want to do is create a system where you could fail, but not be absolutely screwed and like completely out of the way. So as an example, in Anesidora, combat is dealt with a single die roll. So if I'm going to fight someone, I roll the die, and if I succeed, I'm good, I win. And if I fail, I have lost that fight. So you're not attacking each other repeatedly. It is one roll, and you see if you succeed or you fail. And the reason I find that interesting is I think it's more dynamic if you can fail a fight and have to run away and then have to approach it from a different angle without it being like, oh, you've fallen unconscious and now you're defeated.
Yeah.
So I like people to be able to respond to their failures.
That's a really good way. I hadn't thought about that even playing with it. I do remember I really enjoyed the combat system of being so simple, and in a way that if we wanted to, you could make it more, quote, cinematic. You could take the time in explaining, the acts, because all you're slowing down for is that one die roll, as opposed to something like D&D, which can easily turn into a slugfest and a 2-hour long knockdown, drag out, hit point, 1 or 2 hit point difference kind of fight is really easy to run into, where it's one die roll, and if you lose, you can come back, you can do it again, but you do feel it though. There's been several times when I definitely felt the failure of like, oh crap. Speaking of pie baking contests, that was one we definitely felt the failure when we didn't bake enough pies and then got exiled from the city for various other reasons. But that was definitely
very
failing. Very, very specific reasons. That's a really interesting design philosophy that you have there, and I think that could apply to a lot of different storytelling too. Have you had, what's the word? I had a question and then I lost it. We'll move on.
Wonderful.
It had to do with that the philosophy of failing forward, but I think we've beat that horse.
Yeah, I mean, I could say a little bit more, though this does get into the topic of Larping, which is something we were going to talk about before.
Perfect segue.
Which is one of the major philosophies that's becoming more and more popular in LARP communities is the concept of playing to lose. And when I say playing to lose, I mean purposefully making decisions that are not necessarily the best for your character, because it is makes a better story. And that plays in a lot with like all sorts of various LARPs. Just the idea that like you do crazy things and sometimes they come down on you, and that's the fun part of the game. And also like letting other people defeat you because that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Or it was really pronounced we ran a LARP, which Richard was able to play in, called The King in Yellow, where everyone attended a play in my house where we actually performed a play starring a few people, including Rachel Seeley, who some people might recognize from the show.
A couple weeks ago.
Yeah. Oh, no, that was not a couple weeks ago. That was.
Oh, no, she was on this show a couple weeks ago.
Yes.
That's what I mean. Yeah.
Yes. I was going to say, time is compressed right now.
Time is compressed, but yeah, she was on the show a couple weeks ago. Yeah, and she did the play.
Yeah, and she was in the play. So we did the play, and the concept of cosmic horror in and of itself is the idea that like you're powerless against these all-powerful ancient evils. So you don't approach it in the same way that you would approach a Dungeons and Dragons game where you're all heroes trying to defeat the dragon. You approach it as like, how is my character going to be defeated by the darkness? And you see it in cosmic horror, especially like Cthulhu-inspired stuff. You also see it in 10 Candles, which is based on the idea of losing and how you lose.
Yeah.
I think it's an interesting concept.
That just brings me back to that game, which that was really, for me, that was my first foray into cosmic horror as a genre. And I know it was pretty light. You know, I didn't grow up reading the Cthulhu mythos or learning anything about that. So it's always just kind of been on the peripherals of my perspectives of things. But then getting in and enjoying that game, because it got out of hand real fast. Like, it was one of those things where I'm like, all right, this is nice. And, you know, everyone's there. Everyone was in costume, having a good time, playing in character. And then suddenly it was like, doors closed. Doors are now locked. Everything's going insane. People are dying. What's happening? Just insanity. And it was such a fun experience being able in that moment to realize that, like, oh no, we don't get out of this one unscathed. We don't get to have that rescue. And I don't think I realized that before I went to the house, before I showed up. I didn't realize, like, oh yeah, no, I'm gonna lose this game. I'm gonna die. Yeah. And then I died this horrific death thinking that I had made the right choice. I was gonna sacrifice this other guy to the King in Yellow and earn my freedom, and that totally backfired, and then I got executed. It was really fun. Really fun. When you are coming up with those, like, I don't know a ton about cosmic horror. I know you know quite a bit more, but how do you come up with stories and get people on board with that idea of losing?
I think the most important thing is to get people to engage with the idea of exploring a character in a story more than being a hero. And I definitely get how that is like a very different kind of game, because a lot of people, when they get into role-playing games, their goal is to be a hero, to do heroic acts and to defeat monsters and all this kind of stuff. But I find that a lot of people, after they've played the games and they've role-played, they become really interested in exploring characters and building scenes and creating moments. And if your focus is on building scenes and creating moments, then you become much more open to the idea of not winning. But I will also say that when you're doing that kind of stuff, you do want to give people a sense that their actions matter. Because that is something that I definitely like. You don't want everyone to go and be like, oh, like, you can't win. Yeah. So in the King in Yellow, obviously, no one was going to beat the King in Yellow. He's this all-powerful, ancient, evil, unstoppable. But not everyone was trapped. Some people escaped. Yeah. And at the end of the day, the victories that people achieved were either having I guess they could all be wrapped up in the idea of being able to tell a story afterwards about what they did.
Yeah.
So you had some people who did escape, and they get to tell the story about how, oh, I got out, but this is the way that I was damaged by experience. And then you have people who died, and they can say, well, this is all the things I did, and this is how I contributed to other people's stories, and then this is how I was epically defeated, which is another thing. I would say the epicness of defeat is very important. You want people to be able to go down hard. The harder they go down,
Yeah.
the more fun it is. And also the more you can make it like in keeping with their character. So one of our other friends was playing this guy who was an evil sculptor with a vial of magic potion that could turn anyone to stone. And so he had, before the game, used it on his fiancée and turned her to stone as an experiment, and then was invited to the King in Yellow. So this player knew that he had a potion that could turn someone to stone. And he ended up trying to use it on the king, which backfired and turned him to a statue.
I remember that now. Yeah.
So you create this moment where their power backfires on them in an interesting way.
Yeah.
And then you have, interesting stories is a big deal, building interesting things. And the most important thing is, one, that people get to tell a story and they get a chance to do heroic things even within this world. And also you want everyone to be on board in advance that this is going to be a dark story. It's not going to be a heroic story.
Yeah. Which I remember you did spend a lot of time pointing out. This is not... You explained, this is the kind of story we're telling here. And so everyone seemed to be on the same page.
Yeah. I think another great example, I know I keep talking.
Oh, please, go ahead.
One of my favorite movies is this movie called Sunshine that came out about 10 to 15 years ago. It's by Danny Boyle. I don't know if you've ever seen it or
I've not seen that one yet. It's on my list of
I would highly recommend it.
Stuff.
But Sunshine is about a group of astronauts that the sun is shutting down, it's losing its energy, and in order to reignite the sun so that humanity can continue to exist, they send a group of astronauts with a bomb to inject into the center of the sun in order to basically detonate this super explosive at its core and reignite it and allow its chemistry to continue so that humanity can continue to exist. So it's very it's a little harder sci-fi than some things, but it's still very epic, hyper-futuristic, and crazy tech. But the main thing is that they're on this mission where they know they have to complete it. And one by one, a lot of them, they get killed off because terrible things happen and they have to make really hard choices. And in the end, spoilers, everyone dies. I feel like
I had heard that. If you haven't seen it by now, I feel like you can't complain about spoilers.
I feel like I spoiled it a little bit.
Yeah.
But they get a feeling of heroism. They get a feeling of they've saved the world. They've done all these important things. They've sacrificed themselves. But at the end of the day, they're all dead. But they completed their mission. And I think that's a great example of how to tell a cosmic horror story where the people end up dead or highly damaged, but they still get to do something amazing and important.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
As you were explaining that, it was like bringing me back to the game, because that game, I feel like that happened about a year ago, because that was definitely before the new year, right?
I think it was January.
Or was it January? Okay. It was pre-COVID, of course. But yeah, that brings me back to those kind of moments that I got to see and, experience with everyone else, which it's an impressive feat to run a LARP. That's the big thing I was getting at was cosmic horror is cool, but managing 40-some players and a team of how many game mass storytellers did you have for that? 6 or 7?
6 to 8, I think.
6 to 8.
That
managing a team of storytellers who are all on board to mess with people and freak them out.
Yes.
It's something that I looked at that and I was like, this is impressive. So I just got to tell you, I really respect that work that you put into that. That was an amazing thing. There was one moment in the game where I was standing there with the gambler, and someone had dropped a baby, like a quote baby, and one of the storytellers went and they picked up the baby and then act like they ate it. And we were like, what? Our mind was blown because we were like, that creature, he explained, was a creature, just ate the baby. And we were like, this is dark. And that happened relatively early on. And then things just got really way worse from then on. But it was still, quite a feat that you pulled off. And I know you had a lot more experience than just that one, but that was one of my first.
One thing I will say that I love about running these LARPs, because like you said, there's 40 people, there's like 6 to 8 people. I'm mostly running logistics at a LARP. I spend a lot of my time making sure, because when I do my games, there tend to be a lot of crazy things that happen, not just in the story, but also lighting cues and props and stuff. So I spent a lot of my time just logistically making sure things happen. And I put a lot of trust into my storytellers to create moments. So one of the funny things is I have never heard this baby story before.
You never heard the baby story? Man.
That was not something that was planned or discussed in advance. That was something that happened.
I want to say it was David. Is David one of your guys? He had long hair at the time.
Yes. Yeah,
I think
David
it was him who did it, but one of the other players was running around and they had lost their baby, or they had found a baby outside, I think, because outside was it was screwing with us. And then they dropped it, and then he was like, oh yeah, this creature eats the baby. And so we were like, okay. So that's interesting. You never heard that one before, but I guess that was...
Heard that. Or I love, one of the players came up to me at one point and she said, so I thought it was really cool that it turns out that my character is the reincarnation of this ancient god. And I'm like, okay.
They're like, yes, that's exactly what I planned.
Yeah.
That's
great. We're
funny.
gonna roll with it.
Because on top of that, there's 40 players who all come up and have their own stories being told. Obviously, I didn't interact with everybody. I think I only really had meaningful interaction with about 5 or 6 people. But the stories intertwine. You had Brian Forrest was there, and he was going around giving everyone the flowers and being sketchy, which his plan didn't work out as great as it could have. And everyone was working. So I guess you trusted your team to make this story happen. How much work went in ahead of time to make that a reality?
Yeah, so in advance, a lot of work went into the play itself, because we literally put on I think a good 15-minute short play performance. And then my brother played the actual King in Yellow, where we had this huge costume with stilts and all stuff going on. So those were 2 of the biggest things we had to put together. And then in terms of story, it was primarily getting together and talking about thematic elements and being these are the thematic ideas we're playing with. These are the kinds of things we think are cool, but also setting boundaries and being these are the kinds of things that I don't think people want to deal with. Mm-hmm. So I know in Accolade, we had talked about, we didn't want themes of sexism or racism coming into the game. And we had a few other hard boundaries that we wanted to avoid. So you get everyone on the same page, and everyone knows thematically where you're going. And then you tell a story together, and you just trust that people are going to get on the same page. And it also means that sometimes I'll run into a storyteller and I'll just say what story are you telling? Or they'll come to me and say, this is the story I've been telling so far. Can you deal with it now? And so you just sort of take what someone else has been making and you make it your own, and you see what happens.
Yeah, and that takes a special mindset, because I know a lot of storytellers and GMs who, it's their story. They don't want anyone messing with it. So that in itself means that you had to find some really good flexible storytellers to be able to make that work.
And the whole experience, like, it's hyper communal because you also have your 40 players all wanting to tell their own story and put their own spin on every character.
It's definitely a feat. So I commend you for that. I'm looking forward to when COVID chills out, someday hopefully getting to visit Akale Island and see what you came up with that.
Run another game and see everyone again.
It would be really nice to see people in person. Also, that's for sure. I got a couple questions from the chat that I want to throw at you before I get to my other questions. This one has to do with game design, so it kind of throws back to that, is would you suggest simplifying rules as much as possible when designing a game, and when should one stop simplifying or complicating the mechanics of a game?
So in Anesidora, we have been definitely simplifying a lot, and I will say it depends very philosophically on what you're trying to do. So the first thing is when you're doing board games, you can get into a lot more like detail about rules and crunchiness. But in role-playing games, I've found, and this is me philosophically stating something that maybe other people would disagree with, but I think games are moving away from complexity.
I agree.
You can really see it with 4th and 5th edition of Dungeons & Dragons, where 4th edition was super crunchy. There was a lot of mechanics, a lot of things interacting with each other, and a lot of hard rules. And 5th edition is a complete circle from that, where 5th edition is very simple, very straightforward. You have a handful of both paths with your classes. Combat, you don't have your flanking and your 5-foot steps anymore. It's kind of been replaced by a more simplified system. So, and that's D&D. But then you have a number of other systems right now that are getting simpler and simpler, because at the end of the day, you have to ask, are you playing this game for the crunch of the numbers, or are you playing it to tell a story?
Yeah.
And I think more and more people are looking for stories. And I would say, my opinion, it's because crunchiness is much better handled by video games. Yeah. And because you can get so much crunch out of your video game, when you play tabletop role-playing games, you want to get more into that communal story. Like, if I were to sit down and say, what game do I want to play? If I want to play a game that's got a ton of different options and choices and the numbers matter, I'll probably tend towards a video game. Mm-hmm. Even if it's something like, say, World of Warcraft, which fills a lot of the same roles of it's communal, it's social, you have characters and a story, but it is really about being on rails and dealing with numbers and strategy. Yeah. And then you have D&D or other role-playing games, and you say, why am I sitting down with my friends and playing this game? And for me, when I play a role-playing game, I'm sitting down because I want to tell a story. Yeah. So I want rules that help tell that story. So my suggestion would be simplify the rules as much as possible to tell the story you're trying to tell. And if you run into rules and you say, this does not benefit my story, they can probably go. So with Anesidora, we had, we had an attribute system where you would have your physical ability, your magical ability, your social, and I think it was survival was the 4th attribute. Yeah. And they were kind of like bonuses. But what we ended up finding is that by having those in the game, it made people focus into the things that attribute was good at. Right. So, and I felt like that got away from the story we were trying to tell, because what we want to tell with Anesidora is something where characters can kind of do anything, and you can build a character who is good at fighting, but also good at magic or whatever, and it's a point-buy system. So we felt that these attributes were taking away from that and focusing players too much, so we took it out. And then combat is the same way, where 3 years ago, the combat in Anesidora, when we were just playing it with friends for fun, was more like something you'd see in D&D, where you make attacks and you deal damage. Mm-hmm. But then I ran a stream And the thing is, when you're on a stream, that doesn't apply. Like, you want to streamline as much as possible. So I just started being like, oh, well, if you hit the guy, he's dead. And if you miss the guy, something bad happens. And that kind of evolved into the current system. And I feel like every time we play a game, we cut something out of the combat system. Just because the story we're trying to tell isn't about making strategic combat choices. It's about like, oh, a fight happens and we want to see, do you win or do you lose? But I don't really care about if you sidestep the guy.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I would say simplify to the point that it works for your story, but at the same time, keep enough crunch that people know what meaningful choices they're making. Because if you get too loose, you put a lot of pressure on the game master to think like, how can you do this thing and how hard is it?
Mm-hmm.
So I would say the rules are a rail or a guide for the players and the game master to agree on what can players do and how likely are they to succeed. And as long as your rules meet those goals, I think that's what you're going for, what you should do.
That's really good. The guy who asked the question said, I like this dude. This dude knows what's up. So that was really good advice. I really, that point about, you know, if the rule doesn't help you tell the story, do you really need it? Probably not. But I also like that you still kept some of the crunch, because I know people like that, you know, number crunching. I know several people in D&D who are like, they're obsessed with it. That's their thing, is min-maxing and, you know, making this perfect number crunchy kind of thing. So that's
Don't get me wrong, you can get powers and skills in Anesidora. There's crunch.
Oh, right. It's there. Yeah. But you found the places to pare down the rule set, so to make the game tell the story versus having the stuff be there just to be there, right? Yeah. Which I kind of thought that was the case. For me, that was kind of how I felt about 4th edition, was like some of the stuff could have been simpler. And that's why, to me, 5th edition really was where I was like, this is a good balance, I think. Sometimes I think it could be even simpler. Who knows?
I'll just say, I am a big defender of 4th edition.
Okay.
But I know a lot of people don't like 4th edition.
Yeah,
But I enjoyed it because I thought it was very well made in the combat system. I thought the combat system was clean and interesting, and you got cool powers. But most games ended up being like 2 or 3 combats and like a very cool story, simply because you were mostly engaging with the combat system.
I think that was my major experience with it too, was a lot of fights. And also, here's why I kind of like soured on 4th edition, and it has nothing to do with the system itself. It's literally, I was playing with this group that we had, in one session we had 10 players, and we had one player who would take his time, and the DM wouldn't tell him to hurry up. You know, so it became like a waiting game. It would take us like almost 2 hours to go through one round of combat sometimes, depending on the choices being made. So that made me sour on 4th edition quite a bit. But again, different experiences, though, tie into how people see different systems. Another question from the chat, though, this is another one about LARP. And I don't know if you have much experience in this one. What's your best advice for combat-oriented LARPer? And what's the best advice for role-play orientation?
I might need some explanation. If your questioner is still in the chat, do they mean running combat in a parlor LARP, or like combat in an actual like boffer LARP where you're hitting people? Because I will say they are, for obvious, very different.
Yeah.
And I run only parlor LARPs.
Yeah.
And the difference is that a parlor LARP is everyone is fully in their costumes, and you go around and you talk and you portray your character, but when you want to fight something, you stop and determine it in some rule mechanic way, or even if that rule mechanic is we agree upon how this fight will go down, and then you move on. Whereas boffer LARP is a style where you have actual foam weapons and you actually fight each other.
Yeah,
often modified by rules.
he
Okay.
chimed in. He was asking about boffer LARPing. So he says, okay, never mind. Then in terms of roleplay orientation, do you have any sort of anything you do with perhaps new players to get them in the right mindset for LARP roleplaying? Because it is a little different.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot different than sitting at a table.
One of the biggest things I've found, it helps a lot if you have players who have played before in the game. Now, not everyone can have that luxury of having people who've LARPed before play in their games, but nothing gets people in the LARPing mood like having other people in the game already in the mood. Like you can start picking up the energy and you can see how other people are acting, how other people are reacting. In terms of orientation, for my vampire LARP, I actually made an animated video that is on my YouTube channel introducing people to the world of Vampire the Masquerade, where I talked about what vampire was. And then for Acolyte Island, I made a series of videos about the setting, including one that was specifically about safety and behavior in the LARP to orient people to what we were expecting.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the beginning of a LARP, I always start with about a 15 to 30 minute intro where I just talk to everyone about what's expected, what the mood is, who to talk to if you are confused or having problems or have any issues, so that everything is clear in advance and everyone knows who's in charge and who's looking out for them. Yeah. And also I'll say, like, bigger LARPs often will have like an entire day before you even play the game, where it'll be like a weekend and they'll do like Friday or Saturday is orientation day. And they will tell you how to play the game, what's expected of you, talk about characters and all of that. And then your next day or two is the game itself.
Mm-hmm.
So that people are properly oriented for the mood and for safety.
Yeah, that's really good advice right there. I experienced that with Twin Mask. They have a whole to do with safety and stuff for that. Interesting thing though you said about experienced role players. I'm just vouching for that idea, that concept of have experienced role players in a LARP situation to help newer ones get in the mood. Because when I was there for King in Yellow, at first I was very nervous. You know, that was my first parlor LARP. I had done the Twin Mask thing like once before. So that was my first parlor LARP where it was like, this is character driven. And Andre was there, and Andre was relentless in including me in everything. And I was very grateful for that, because that made me be like, okay, I got to get out of my shell. I got to be a part of this story. I have to participate, which can be tough for new players. So, you know, having Andre there, I know he is experienced, and he, I think, was part of your storytelling team at the same time. I believe. I don't know. But that was, having those those experienced players there definitely was a huge help for getting.
I think another great example. So I ran a LARP about 2 to 3 years ago at this point. It was my first big LARP in LA, where I've been wanting to run a game forever. I miss LARPing, and I like a certain style of production. So I had just gotten to a new place, and it was essentially empty. I hadn't moved in. I hadn't unpacked any boxes. And I was like, you know what would be awesome if we turn this house into an escape room? So I went to Home Depot and I chained doors closed, and I put like reflector tape in spots. So if you like looked through a hole in the wall, you could like see writing on the wall that gave you codes that were necessary to unlock the door. I did all sorts of craziness. And I went to thrift stores and bought like paintings for $1 so I could put them on all the walls. And I did a haunted museum LARP. And for that one, like, first off, the thrift store stuff and the locks, that helps set the mood a lot.
Oh yeah.
But then we got started, we got into the game. There was a bit of a performance element where me and other NPC characters talked to each other. And we started the game with a party where the museum was opening. So people got to get in the mood of like, oh, we're at the opening of the museum. They got to talking to each other. They got to exploring their characters. and the people who were storytellers were all playing NPCs, going through the room, setting the tone with their performances and their interactions with people. And then things started going south, magic started happening, and a moment that I really remember being big was Cynthia Marie picked up a haunted mask, and I told her, like, you feel a dark magical energy radiating from the mask, and she was like, do you mind if I like absolutely freak out? And I was like, go for it, have fun. So she fell on the ground, freaked out, threw the mask across the room, started screaming, and told everyone about how she'd seen this terrible vision of horrible things when she touched the mask. And everyone in the room was like, oh, what's going on? And from then on, I just felt like the role playing was really happening and the energy was there.
Wow, that's a great moment. That's really fun. To wind down the conversation, thank you for telling those stories. I really enjoy hearing about that. It's fun. Those LARP stories are really fun. I warned you right before we started the stream. I have 2 questions for you.
Okay.
I gave you 5 minutes notice that these were going to happen. So the first one is, as a storyteller or a game master, whichever title you prefer, what is one thing you struggle with the most?
I would say my biggest one, which I know isn't very common, is self-doubt. In the sense that, like, I always worry, are my players having fun? Are things going well? Is everyone engaged? Is every player, like, actually, like, interacting? And there's also an element, which I will say, of, are people here because they enjoy the game? Or are they here because they're my friend? And so that is my greatest weakness of self-doubt as a game master.
So how do you get past that?
I don't know.
Or you just suck it up and go back. I feel like that's a pretty common.
Bigger and bigger. I mean, the biggest thing is I go really big with my games. I try to do what I can to, like, make them crazy and interactive. I don't do them very often. Like, my LARPs, I was only running about every 3 months.
Yeah.
Just because, like, it takes a lot of energy to do things that crazy. And my personal games, I tend to only run about every other week so that I can maintain that energy. And then at the game, I do a lot of checking in with people. So in LARPing, if I see a player and they look like they're just in a corner, or maybe they're in the eating, like, we have like a non-character area where people can just hang out. And if I see people in those situations, I will go and talk to them and be like, are you having fun? Are there any problems? What can we do to help you engage? Or are you just hanging out and want to rest for a moment? Just to do a lot of check-ins, make sure things are good. And then in the tabletop games, I actually built into Anesidora a sort of check-in system where when you're doing scenes in Anesidora and, like, exploring or whatever, you got a card for each character. And as those players act, we kind of, like, tap those cards so that you can look at the table and go, oh, wait, this player hasn't done anything. And you're in the rules, you're supposed to ask that player, what are you doing in the scene? What is happening to your character? Is there anything you want to do? So that there's a check-in, and so every player gets to interact with it. So that's how I try to overcome that weakness.
That's a really good method, and no one else has said that weakness before. In terms of that self-doubt, no one said it, because no one who's in the public eye, and that's a lot of people I interview are very in the public eye, trying to be, a figure of some sort. No one will admit that part, I think. I agree. I have that problem all the time. I finish a game and then I'm like, oh, that was terrible. I get in that mindset. But I'm like that. I probably wouldn't have thought of that. So that's a really good one. I think a lot of other DMs will see that and understand that mindset. Now, the last question is for brand new storytellers, game masters, dungeon masters. What is your one piece of advice for people just getting started?
Oh, I had a really good one, and now I've forgotten it.
Oh, cool. Okay. Good one.
One thing that I think is really important as someone really helpful is to look at what other people have done. So there's a lot of like pre-made adventures and stuff, and everyone knows about them. But if you look at like these pre-made games and adventures, you can often build stories off of them, and then you can get a feel for it. So you run a game where maybe you just straight up run the game that's pre-written and see what happens with the pre-written game. But once you've done that, you can get a sense of like, what is the story I want to tell? And can I look at what other people have done in order to build off of it? And also, this also builds off of, don't be afraid to look at what other people have done in the past. Because I can tell you, big artists reference other works all the time. Almost every movie you've ever seen is inspired by something that either happened in real life or happened in an ancient story or happened in a more modern film. And if you can take inspiration from all these things and build a cool story around it, if you even look at, say, The King in Yellow, that big LARP I ran, The King in Yellow is a character originally created by Robert Chambers that was then built on by Lovecraft, that was then built on for 80 to 100 more years by various writers who've done so many different iterations of the character of the King in Yellow, the ancient evil god, and who he is. And so for our game, we pulled from this 100 years of history and story to build this game and go from there. So that's my advice. Don't be afraid to look at what other people have already done and make it your own.
That is very good advice. That's really good. I don't think I can add on to that. That's that's very clear. I didn't know that about King in Yellow. I know Lovecraft and I know cosmic horror is very, very old, but I did not realize the King in Yellow as a character was 100 years old. That's really interesting. I really need to go do some reading on all that.
Interesting.
Yeah. I think because of the LARP, that's when I started looking at like other, cosmic horror ideas. And the one day we had the board game day at your place where we got to play with the Cthulhu Wars, I think is what the game was that we played. That also kind of piqued my interest. So I have a lot of research to do. All that being said,
I want to say one of my favorite writers, who I don't think people would technically call cosmic horror, but was dark ghost stories, is M.R. James. I would recommend Ghost Stories by M.R. James. He wrote
Ghost Stories by
M.R.
like the letter M?
Yes, M.R. James.
Okay.
And when I say ghost stories, I don't mean like a book called Ghost Stories. I mean like he wrote like 100 short stories about antiquities and cursed objects and ghosts and spirits. And he wrote all of them in like the 1910s, I want to say. So they're they predate Lovecraft. And they were really interesting. And not many people talk about it.
No, I've never heard of that. But again, I'm not really in that world so much. But that's something, now I gotta go look that up. Very cool. Bruce, thank you for coming on the show today. I appreciate you taking the time and talking about Anesidora. And I hope we get to see something coming out with Anesidora in the somewhat near future. Whether a Kickstarter or more information. That link will be in the description of this video as soon as the stream is over. But yeah, thank you. And those of you guys watching, thanks for joining in, talking LARP and game design. Yeah. Actually, one last thing. Where can people find you online? I always ask this one, and I totally forgot just now. Where can people find you?
I'm at Bruce Monach on Twitter and Instagram. And AnesidoraTheGame.com is where I have the game. Anesidora also has a Twitter account where I plan on posting things. You can also sign up for emails. In addition, I am Bruce Monach on YouTube, where you can find my Vampire LARP intro video, my Acolyte Island intro video, my Anesidora, like World of Anesidora video, and the original series, Pen and Paper and Laser Guns, which I shot like 7 years ago at this point, starring a lot of people would recognize who have gone on to become very big in the gaming and D&D community.
Yeah, so make sure you guys check that out as well. That's all linked in the description. That's the show. Thanks for watching.
Thank you.